They thought she was just another old woman they could push aside. 40 years of dedication. Countless crises solved, millions in revenue generated. Al dismissed with cruel jokes and whispered comments about being past her prime. But Pearl Ocrax wasn't just any employee. She was a woman who built her career brick by brick in a man's world. And when they tried to tear her down, they awakened something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. This is the story of how one woman's quiet dignity became the most devastating weapon of all. Pearl Ocrax had seen at Ulot 61. She possessed something money couldn't buy: institutional memory. She remembered when the company was just 3 desks in a cramped office, when handshake deals sealed million-dollar agreements, when trust meant everything. For nearly 4 decades, Pearl had been the backbone of Meridian Financial Consulting. She weathered the 2008 crisis, navigated regulatory changes that destroyed competitors, and mentored countless young professionals who now ran major firms across the country. Her office walls were lined with commendations, photos with industry leaders, and thank you notes from clients whose financial futures she'd secured. But walls don't protect you from the shifting tides of corporate culture. The first crack appeared when Marcus Chen, the 32-year-old wunderkind, became CEO with his MBA from Wharton and his talk of digital transformation and agile methodologies. He brought a new energy that the board found intoxicating. Behind his polished smile and motivational speeches, however, lurked a cold calculation. The old guard had to go. Pearl first noticed the change in the small things. Her opinions, once sought after in strategy meetings, were now met with patronizing nods. Her decades of experience were suddenly labeled as resistance to change. Young executives would exchange glances when she spoke, their expressions saying what their words couldn't. She was a relic. The attacks started subtly during team meetings. Marcus would interrupt her mid-sentence with a dismissive wave. "Let's focus on forward-thinking solutions, Pearl," he'd say, his tone dripping with false kindness. "We need fresh perspectives for the modern market." Pearl's jaw would tighten, but she remained professional. Survived far worse than a boy trying to prove himself. The whispers grew louder in the break room. She'd catch fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered. "Maybe it's time for some people to enjoy retirement. The younger generation thinks differently. She's slowing us down." Pearl felt the isolation creeping in like a slow poison. Lunch invitations stopped coming. Her input was no longer requested on major accounts. She'd personally developed files that had been her responsibility for years, were quietly reassigned to junior staff who looked at her with a mixture of pity and superiority. But the real blow came during the quarterly review meeting. Marcus stood at the head of the conference table, his presentation laser-focused on modernizing our human resources. Charts and graphs filled the screen, all pointing to one conclusion: older employees were dragging down productivity metrics. "We need to consider the cost-benefit analysis of our staffing structure," Marcus announced, his eyes deliberately avoiding Pearl's. "In today's competitive landscape, we can't afford to carry dead weight." Pearl's hands clenched in her lap. 40 years of loyalty. And this is how they spoke about her, not to her face. Of course, that would be too honest. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as corporate restructuring. Pearl found herself excluded from client calls she'd managed for decades. Her access to certain databases was mysteriously revoked due to security updates. Her office, once positioned near the executive suite, was relocated to a cramped space near the copy machines. The junior associates, sensing the shift in power, began treating her like an outdated piece of equipment. They'd speak around her, their voices filled with the casual cruelty of youths convinced of its own superiority. "Did you see how she still uses printed reports?" Jessica, a 26-year-old analyst, whispered to her colleague. "It's like watching a dinosaur try to use a smartphone." Pearl heard every word. She was meant to. The breaking point came when Robert Harrison, one of Pearl's most important clients, called to complain about a miscommunication regarding his portfolio. According to the official report filed by Trevor, a junior advisor Pearl had been training, she had given outdated and potentially harmful advice that contradicted the firm's new investment strategy. Pearl knew it was a leashed, documented every conversation, every recommendation, every decision point. But when she presented her evidence to HR, she was met with concerned looks and patronizing explanations about misunderstandings and generational communication gaps. "Perhaps you misremembered the conversation, Pearl," said Sarah Martinez, the HR director, who was barely older than Pearl's own daughter. "At your age, It's common to mix up details. No shame in that. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Pearl sat in her relocated office, staring at the formal notice in her hands. They weren't just trying to push her out anymore, they were destroying her reputation, ensuring she'd leave in disgrace for the first time in her career. Pearl Ocrax felt truly powerless, but here's what Marcus Chen and his army of ambitious young professionals failed to understand. They weren't dealing with a broken old woman, they were dealing with someone who'd built a career on patience, strategy, and an intimate understanding of how power really worked, and Pearl was about to remind them why experience always trumps arrogance that evening. Pearl sat in her study at home, surrounded by 4 decades of professional memories, photo albums, filled with company events, industry conferences, and celebration dinners, contact lists that read like a who's who of the financial world, letters of recommendation she'd written for dozens of protégés who now held senior positions across the industry. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. David Reynolds speaking. David, it's Pearl Ocrax. There was immediate warmth in his voice. Pearl, my God, it's been too long. How are things at Meridian? David had been one of her first mentees, fresh out of college and terrified of his first client presentation. Now he was a senior partner at Goldman Sachs. Pearl had attended his wedding, celebrated his promotions, and provided career advice whenever he needed it. That's actually why I'm calling, Pearl said carefully. I could use some advice about a delicate situation. Over the next hour, she laid out everything: the systematic exclusion, the fabricated complaints, the upcoming disciplinary hearing. David listened without interruption, his anger growing with each detail. This is unconscionable, he said. Finally, Pearl, you trained half the executives in this city. The financial community owes you more than it can ever repay. I'm not looking for charity, David. I'm looking for justice. What do you need? Pearl smiled for the first time in weeks. Information and patience. The calls continued through the night. Margaret Torres, now CFO at a major investment bank; Jonathan Kim, who ran his own consulting firm; Lisa Chang, a senior regulatory attorney. Each conversation followed the same pattern: shock, outrage, and immediate offers of support. But Pearl wasn't ready to play her hand yet. She had learned long ago that the most effective battles are won before your enemy realizes they're fighting. She began with research using contacts she'd maintained throughout her career. Pearl started gathering intelligence on Meridian's recent activities: financial reports, regulatory filings, client communications, personnel decisions. She requested documents under the guise of historical research for her upcoming retirement. She discovered made her blood run cold. Marcus Chen's modernization efforts had involved several questionable practices, aggressive sales tactics that pushed clients into high-fee products they didn't need, risk assessments that were deliberately understated to meet quarterly targets, and, most damning of all, a pattern of billing irregularities that suggested systematic overcharging of long-term clients. Pearl had stumbled upon a web of financial misconduct that made her forced retirement look like a minor personnel issue. She worked methodically, building her case with the same attention to detail that had made her legendary among clients. Every document was verified, every source cross-referenced, every timeline confirmed. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about protecting the clients who had trusted Meridian with their life savings. 3 days before her disciplinary hearing, Pearl received an unexpected visit. Tomas Wright, a 70-year-old client she'd worked with for over 20 years, knocked on her office door with tears in his eyes. Pearl, I need to talk to you, he said, his voice shaking. That young man, Trevor, he convinced me to move my retirement portfolio into some new investment product. Said it was your recommendation. Pearl's heart sank. She'd never recommended any such product, for Thomas's risk tolerance was extremely conservative, and she'd spent years building him a stable, low-risk portfolio designed to preserve his wealth through retirement. Thomas, I never made that recommendation. What exactly did you invest in? As Thomas explained the details, Pearl realized the scope of the deception. Trevor hadn't just fabricated the client complaint that led to her disciplinary hearing. He'd actually implemented harmful financial advice using her name, putting a vulnerable retiree's life savings at risk. That evening, Pearl made another round of calls. This time, she wasn't reaching out to former protégés for support. She was calling investigative journalists. Jennifer Walsh had built her career exposing corporate fraud. Her series on pension fund mismanagement had won a Pulitzer Prize and sent 3 executives to prison. When Pearl explained what she'd discovered at Meridian, Jennifer's response was immediate. Can you prove it? Every word. Documents, recordings, witness testimony. But I need protection. They're trying to destroy my reputation, to discredit anything I might say, Pearl. If what you're telling me is true, your reputation is about to become untouchable. Can you meet me tomorrow? Pearl smiled grimly. I've been waiting 40 years for this conversation. The disciplinary hearing was set for Thursday morning, but by Wednesday evening, Pearl Ocrax was no longer playing defense. She was about to launch an offensive that would shake the financial industry to its core. Thursday morning arrived with unusual energy at Meridian Financial. Pearl arrived early, as she always did, carrying a leather briefcase that had been her companion for decades, but today, it contained something far more powerful than client files and financial reports. It contained justice. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. In the main conference room, Marcus Chen sat at the head of the table, flanked by HR Director Sarah Martinez and Legal Counsel Trevor. The junior advisor who had fabricated the complaint sat nervously to one side, his confidence from previous weeks noticeably absent. Ms. Ocrax, Marcus began with practiced authority. We're here to discuss serious concerns about your professional conduct, specifically allegations that you provided inappropriate financial advice to client Robert Harrison, advice that contradicted our firm's established investment strategies. Pearl sat calmly, her hands folded on the table. I understand the allegations, Mr. Chen. Before we proceed, I'd like to present some additional information that might be relevant to this discussion. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. I've prepared a comprehensive timeline of my interactions with Mr. Harrison, including recorded phone conversations, documented email exchanges, and detailed notes from every meeting. Marcus's expression tightened slightly. Ms. Ocrax, while we appreciate your preparation, the investigation has already— I'm not finished, Pearl interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in the industry. I've also prepared similar documentation for 17 other clients who have reported similar miscommunications over the past 6 months. Interestingly, all of these incidents involved the same junior advisor making unauthorized changes to investment strategies using my name. Trevor's face went pale. Sarah Martinez leaned forward, suddenly alert. Pearl continued, her voice steady and professional. Furthermore, I've identified a pattern of billing irregularities that appears to have generated approximately $2.3 million in unauthorized fees over the past 18 months. These fees were collected from long-term clients who trusted the firm's reputation and my personal recommendations. The room fell silent. Marcus tried to maintain his composure, but Pearl could see the panic creeping into his eyes. These are serious allegations, Ms. Ocrax, Sarah said carefully. Do you have evidence to support these claims? Pearl smiled. Extensive evidence. Documentation that I've already shared with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and investigative journalists at the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Marcus, who had entered the meeting with the confidence of a man destroying an obstacle, now looked like a defendant facing a jury. Furthermore, Pearl continued, I've been in contact with several former colleagues who have expressed concerns about the treatment of senior employees at this firm. We've documented a pattern of age discrimination that violates both federal employment law and basic human decency. She stood up, her presence commanding the room in a way it hadn't been allowed to for months. So let me clarify the situation. Mr. Chun, you can proceed with this disciplinary hearing based on fabricated evidence and false testimony, or you can address the systematic fraud and discrimination that has infected this company under your leadership. But understand this, regardless of what happens in this room today, the truth is already public. The story broke that afternoon. Jennifer Walsh's article, titled The Gray Ceiling: How Age Discrimination Enabled Financial Fraud at Meridian Consulting, dominated the financial news cycle. The piece detailed not just Pearl's case, but a broader pattern of misconduct that had been hidden behind ageist corporate culture. Pearl's phone rang constantly for more clients called to express their support and share their own stories of suspicious changes to their portfolios. Agencies requested interviews, ***. Other financial firms, eager to distance themselves from Meridian's scandal, reached out with job offers. But perhaps most satisfying was the call from David Reynolds at Goldman Sachs. Pearl, I just finished reading the article. I'm proud to call you my mentor. This isn't about pride, David. It's about accountability. Well, you've certainly achieved that. Marcus Chen submitted his resignation an hour ago. The board is in emergency session, And word is they're conducting a complete audit of all client accounts from the past 2 years. Pearl felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her, not vindictive pleasure, but the deep contentment that comes from seeing justice served. Over the following weeks, the fallout continued. Trevor was terminated and faced criminal charges for fraud. Martinez resigned under pressure. Several other employees who had participated in the discriminatory treatment were reassigned or let go. More importantly, Meridian implemented comprehensive policy changes addressing age discrimination and client protection. Pearl was offered her position back, with a significant raise and public apology from the board of directors, but Ocrax had other plans. 6 months later, Pearl stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Workplace Equality. Her story had become a symbol of resistance against age discrimination, inspiring similar cases across multiple industries. They thought my experience was a liability. She told the audience they saw my gray hair and assumed I was obsolete. But experience isn't just about knowing what works, it's about understanding how systems function, how power operates, and how to navigate complexity that younger professionals haven't encountered yet. The applause was thunderous, and the audience sat dozens of older workers who had been inspired by her example to challenge discrimination in their own workplaces. Had used her settlement from Meridian to establish the Experience Matters Foundation, providing legal support and advocacy for workers facing age discrimination. Her network of former protégés, now senior executives across the industry, served as advisors and financial supporters. But perhaps her greatest victory was personal. She had proven that dignity and integrity, combined with strategic thinking and patient preparation, could triumph over institutional cruelty. In her new office, Pearl kept a photo from her final day at Meridian. It showed her walking out of the building, briefcase in hand, surrounded by colleagues who had come to wish her well. But it wasn't a farewell. It was a graduation. She had evolved from a corporate employee into something far more powerful, a voice for justice, a protector of the vulnerable, and a reminder that experience, properly applied, is the most formidable weapon of all today. Pearl Ocrax continues her work as an advocate for workplace equality. The Pearl Standard has become shorthand in HR circles for comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. Several states have adopted legislation inspired by her case, strengthening protections for older workers. Marcus Chen, meanwhile, struggled to find another executive position. His name became synonymous with the toxic leadership style that prioritizes youth over wisdom, innovation over insight. He eventually left the financial industry entirely. Pearl's story reminds us that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is construction, building a better system, creating lasting change, and ensuring that future generations won't face the same injustices. She had been underestimated because of her age, dismissed because of her experience, and attacked because of her dedication. But in the end, those very qualities that made her a target also made her unstopped. Pearl Ocrax didn't just get revenge, she got justice, and sometimes that's the most devastating response of all, because in a world that worships youth and dismisses experience, the most radical act is proving that wisdom, patience, and strategic thinking will always triumph over arrogance, haste, and cruelty. Ocrax's silent resistance became a roar that changed an entire industry, and that perhaps is the most beautiful revenge of all. Thanks for watching. Pearl's silent revenge was absolutely perfect. Patience and strategy always win. Question for you: have you ever seen someone underestimated because of their age at work? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more satisfying revenge stories.